This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of Terms of Reference for 2017. I always get excited at the beginning of a new year. I think there's something important about moments like these that allow us a collective opportunity to not only enjoy time with friends and family, but also take stock of where things stand and what we might like to change. While I remain totally humbled that you're now listening to the 132nd episode we're now publishing here on TOR, I've also spent the closing of last year receiving feedback, working with our team, and getting energized for how we will continue to grow, shape, and evolve this show to do our part in helping to make aid and development better. As you are no doubt aware, we're standing at the precipice of a time when the aid and development sector will come under unprecedented scrutiny and pressure. With Brexit and now the election of Trump, it's not a question of if, but when this will happen. The time couldn't be more ripe for taking bold steps to better define why what we do to help others not only matters, but is effective in ending suffering and creating change. I, for one, am up for the challenge, and I hope you'll join me. The fact that we find ourselves at this precipice, however, is why I'm especially excited to bring you this episode. Because, you see, a little more than a year ago, the U.S. State Department also experienced one of these reflective moments where they realized there was, potentially, a massive source of energy and innovation that had never before been tapped, right in their own backyard. What came out of that moment was the piloting of an office in Silicon Valley to learn how they might contribute to solutions for some of the world's most difficult challenges. My guest, Zvika Krieger, has been at the forefront of that pilot, and he's here to tell us what they've learned and what will happen next. I spoke with Zvika in Berkeley. And hey guys, before we jump into the show, believe it or not, showing your support for this show actually matters. Please do take a moment to leave me a review in iTunes or simply share this episode with your community, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, whatever, it all works. I especially love it when you comment on the blog because I see them all and I answer every single one. All it takes is a couple of clicks and it really does help. And if you're truly interested in making aid and development better, sign up for my newsletter and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode or an update. Now on to the show with Zvika. Hello, Zvika. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
You are probably, like so many of our other guests, a person of the world, even though I'm super excited to talk about your title. Where do we find you sitting today?
I am actually sitting in my car, having just returned from a long drive from Palo Alto to San Francisco to my home in Berkeley, basically traversing the length of Silicon Valley, which is not atypical for a usual day for me out here in California.
I love that you've set it up that way. And just for the record, you are not the first person to take an interview in their car. It seems like that happens more often than not, actually. I think, no, that's not true. You have one of the coolest titles that we've definitely had on this particular podcast, which is you are the State Department rep to Silicon Valley. And so I needed to start out by asking, how the heck did you find yourself in this position?
How did I find myself in this position? Well, it has been a long and winding road that is certainly not linear. To give the Cliff Notes version, I was a journalist for about a decade. I spent most of my career out in the Middle East as a foreign correspondent, and then made my way back to Washington and worked for a couple of magazines back in Washington. And then in 2012, had gotten a call from the Defense Department to work there for a few years, worked for a guy named Ash Carter, who's currently the Secretary of Defense. At the time, he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, helped write the DoD climate change strategy, worked on the innovation agenda, which is as nebulous a portfolio as it sounds, but basically how do we help make the Pentagon and our military more innovative? And through that, did a lot of work engaging with Silicon Valley and the emerging technology trends and cutting edge companies out here. And then moved over to the U.S. State Department, where I helped set up our innovation lab and put together a team of about 10 folks to set that up at the State Department, ran that for about 2 years, where basically our job was to come up with innovative solutions to complex policy challenges, basically think outside the box and provide some alternative ideas that that might not come up through the usual bureaucracy. And then about a little over a year ago, our Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2 person at the State Department, Tony Blinken, had this increasing recognition that the State Department wasn't doing enough to engage with Silicon Valley. And that sort of came out of the recognition, first of all, that a lot of big tech companies were having more of an impact on international issues and the global challenges that we face at the State Department. They were having more of an impact than a lot of countries to which we have full embassies to. And so we should at least have somebody whose job it was to manage and build relationships with those big tech companies. And then even more than that, recognizing that technology as a tool can really help move the needle on a lot of the most difficult stuff that we were working on. But technology isn't really a tool in most diplomats' toolbox. And so we needed to come out to Silicon Valley to try and leverage the broader tech and innovation community out here to get involved in the kinds of issues that we're dealing with and help us think about new approaches and new solutions. And so at the time I was running the innovation lab in Washington, I had that experience doing Silicon Valley engagement at the Defense Department. So he said, this is a new initiative. Would you be interested in moving out to Silicon Valley and seeing, is there value in having a State Department office out here? Let's sort of take a page out of Silicon Valley's playbook and do this, create a prototype, or bootstrapping it, as they might say out here. And before we commit tons of resources, will you sort of scout out, what is the value proposition of having the State Department engagement in Silicon Valley? Will people even talk to us? And if so, who? And what do they want to talk to us about? And what's the value proposition for them talking to us and the value proposition of us talking to them? And so that is how I wound up out here.
What I love the most about the story, other than the fact that you are sitting where you are now, is the fact that you continue to confirm the ridiculously circuitous route that we all find ourselves following in order to get to where we are, right? There's no career path that would have brought you here other than the one that you are on, right? And so it's not serendipity as much as it is, keep moving forward and voila, here you are. One of the things that you just said was an example or something that Aid recognized was that there were these tech companies having an impact that Aid wasn't having. And that was one of the impetuses for you to go out and make these connections. Can you give us an example of maybe one of those? What was one of the impacts that you saw that you said, wait a second, that's in our bailiwick. Why aren't we doing that?
Sure. I mean, there's so many different examples. I mean, I think that really the entree for a lot of these tech companies into the sort of international affairs, humanitarian world, development world was really, I would say, the first entree was through disaster relief. I think that was something that these companies really started to wake up to the possibility that they could have an impact, whether it's, Facebook and Safety Check, or a lot of these other companies that were, bringing internet access to relief-stricken areas, or a lot of, connectivity, or helping to coordinate the response, or sort of mobilizing their platforms for spreading information and awareness in a sort of information deficit environment. So you saw a lot of companies doing some pretty innovative things in the disaster relief space. And I think that was also a good space for these companies to get involved with because it was not political. These were not man-made political challenges. These were acts of God, if you will. And so they were, there was not.
They were safe ground.
Dicey geostrategic issues that they had to wade into. But I do think that was the sort of entree for a lot of these companies. And once they started to realize the impact they could have, they started getting involved in a lot of other issues. I mean, there's also other areas in which they were engaging that are pretty directly tied to their bottom line. Like something that you see a lot of in Silicon Valley is companies taking innovative approaches to bringing internet connections to people who are in off-grid situations. And so whether that's internet.org being driven by Facebook, or Project Loon through Google X, or lots of other initiatives out here, that is obviously having internet is essential for a lot of the products that Silicon Valley creates. And so on the one hand, there's a development imperative to bringing access to internet. And, we see a lot of correlations to positive development outcomes by giving people access to the internet. But of course, there's a business case for those things as well. So I think that a lot of the early engagement that you've seen from Silicon Valley was both disaster relief, but also things that aligned with their core business interests. And then now you see them spreading out into broader issue areas, whether it's, education or food security or energy access or refugees, even things that are sort of straight up CSR work that don't affect their bottom line. They're really making a difference across the spectrum and really sort of showing traditional actors, whether it's the government sector or the NGO or international organizations, that new ways of doing things and sort of opening up our eyes to new approaches.
So how's the scouting going so far? I mean, how long have you been in Silicon Valley? Does your business card give you entree? I mean, are you talking to Mark Zuckerberg now, or what? What's the...
Well, we did have a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg and Secretary Kerry in this summer. So I guess the answer to that question would be yes.
Score, nice.
But I think that first of all, we were surprised. I've been out here for a year. And we were surprised at how receptive the companies were, because we did not take that for granted, particularly in the post-Snowden era. There's certainly some suspicion about engaging with the U.S. government. There's certainly some...
Is that a thing that people say now, the post-Snowden era?
It's certainly a sort of...
Like you walk into a meeting in Silicon Valley, people are like, we're in the post-Snowden era. Like, that's interesting. I haven't heard that meme particularly.
Yes, that's definitely, especially in government circles, it's certainly a way of describing the landscape out here right now and how people engage with us. And then, of course, there's hot button issues these days like encryption and backdoors that tend to dominate the headlines. And so we didn't take for granted that tech companies will want to talk to us. And as I would say, sort of another strike against us, particularly being the State Department, is we don't have a lot of money. We're not the Defense Department. We're not even the Department of Homeland Security. And so we're not here on an acquisitions mission, which is what a lot of other government agencies come to Silicon Valley for. And so we didn't take for granted that people would even want to talk to us. And when we first moved out here, the Defense Department actually created a Silicon Valley office a few months before we got out here. And when I first came out here, one of the first meetings I had was with someone from the Defense Department's Silicon Valley office. And they said, "You don't have any money. Why would anyone want to talk to you in Silicon Valley?"
Hey, let me lift you up. Let me support you as part of the same team. I guess you're not on the same team, right?
Well, we have very different mission sets. And so we didn't take that for granted. And so there's a reason we didn't send 20 people out here and rent a big office space and, give cover story interviews to all the big media outlets, because we weren't sure that this was something, we weren't sure that people would even be willing to talk to us. And so,
but the opposite has been
surprised. True. Yeah. We've been really surprised. And I think what that really comes down to is the fact that, yes, Silicon Valley is driven by money. And everyone here talks about A rounds and exits and unicorns and IPOs and VC funding and all of that. But beneath the drive to make money is the drive to have a global impact. And if you want to make a lot of money, starting a startup here in Silicon Valley is not the best way to do it. You can go into finance, you can go into banking, even into, being a lawyer. Those professions are much more of a surefire way to make money. And so really people come here over other of those well-worn professions because they want to make a difference.
That's a huge, I want to just pause on that particular meme right there, just because anybody who spends any time on Twitter or Facebook or, the Zuckerbergs and the, Snapchat looking to IPO here in the near future, like that is the thing that people believe, right? That you come out there, you swing the bat a few times and, you're on your way to billionaire status. But you're saying your perspective, having been out there for a year, is, impacts the more important conversation.
Yeah. And I think that, the question is, how do you tap into that? And that desire to really make a difference out in the world. And that's what we've been working on over the past year out here.
So now you're a year in, there's been receptivity. So what's the next step? What do the next 2 or 3 years look like for you? Is it filling out an office? Is it picking one or two initiatives to go for? Is it connecting them to something like the Global Innovation Exchange? What are those, you're one person. So how do we divide your time up to make, get the most impact out of what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I think the best news is that, we sort of had our 1-year pilot, and the leadership of the State Department decided that, we have proven value out here. And so this office now we're an official office in the State Department. We're on the org chart, we're institutionalized, so we're no longer a pilot. And they're actually going to be assigning a foreign service officer to come out here to make this their sort of permanent posting.
That has to be the most hotly contested foreign service post ever.
Yeah. And so, but as a recognition that this is not just a boondoggle, that like even in the year that we've been out here, I can draw like a straight line between things that we've done and concrete impact on the ground, which is actually not something that you can even say in government all that often, because government is so slow and bureaucratic, and our budget often works in 3-year cycles. And so it's really, in 1 year to be able to point to immediate impact is a pretty big deal in government. And I think that really just is a testament to the fact that Silicon Valley is about action. People don't like to lean back in their chairs and sort of pontificate about the state of the world. They say, okay, you've convinced me that there's a challenge here. What can we do? And when can we do it? And I'll give you an example. Our first initiative that we launched out here was in January, and it was on Syrian refugees. We sort of hung out a shingle. This was, within my first month of arriving here, and said, we're going to try and, engage a tech sector on refugees. We didn't know who was going to show up. We got a big sort of meeting room at Stanford, and we had almost 100 different tech companies send representatives to this workshop, together with NGOs, people from across the development world, other foreign governments who have offices in Silicon Valley send representatives. We had academic experts and researchers in the space, and we gathered everyone together. And we said, okay, we're not going to do a typical government convening. We're going to do no keynotes, no speeches, no panels. We're just going to dive right in, roll up our sleeves. Let's divide people up into working groups based on different aspects of the challenge. Let's bring in some design thinking facilitators so that this can actually be interactive and help us identify concrete needs. And so we did, some journey mapping, some need finding, looked at the existing efforts, mapped those onto the needs, see where the real opportunities were, looked at those opportunity areas and saw where could tech help move the needle. And then we did some brainstorming on some ideas. And then right there at the workshop, we even started prototyping some of these ideas. And we did some presentations at the end, voted on the best ideas. And we had about 8 ideas that came out of the workshop. And at the end of the workshop, I said, okay, who's going to execute these ideas? Because the State Department doesn't have the money to execute these ideas, nor the bandwidth or the resources. And so companies just started raising their hands. And, one company says, I'll do this one and I'll do that one. And, sometimes it was a startup that was going to pair up with the foundation, or sometimes we'd bring an NGO and a big tech company together to start up. And, people were just raising their hands. And I said, okay, great. This is excellent. So I'll check back with you guys in 6-7 months to see sort of what progress has been made. Maybe we'll all reconvene and see what's happening. And these companies would turn around and say, we can do this in a week.
I was just going to say, I was hoping that you were going to say that, because I heard you say 6-7 months, and I'm hoping the eyebrows were like, you mean next week?
Yeah, well, in government, 6 months would be really fast. And so, this was, it sort of blew my government mind at how fast a lot of these companies could do things. And so I think that the fact that we've been able to show some concrete impact, where ideas that we had in that workshop are on the ground being used by refugees today and benefiting from them, is incredibly fast. It was enough for us to be able to prove value in even just a short period of time out here.
What's been any type of pushback that you've found? Obviously it hasn't been all roses and sunshine. When you go into a meeting and, is one of the key questions, well, you don't have any money, so why should I prioritize you? Or is it the Snowden effect? Or what are the pushback pieces?
I would say there are some pushback pieces. I think some of it is cultural. I spend a lot of time having senior officials from Washington come out here. We'll set up meetings, and I think that a lot of them just have no idea how Silicon Valley operates. They'll have a meeting with a senior official at Facebook, and really what they want is social media 101. what is this Facebook thing that you guys do? And that's not
Dear
what
God.
you get from a senior official, senior leader at Facebook. And so a lot of there's that disconnect. And, people in Washington really, a lot of them feel like the world revolves around them. So they'll come out here and essentially start tasking people in Silicon Valley to do things. And these companies just turn around and say, we don't work for you. We don't have to do anything. And so a lot of it has been about, where do we find that win-win? Where do we find incentives that align? As I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's, straight up social impact, and sometimes it's, or CSR, and sometimes there's a intersecting market or business interest for them. And some of these companies are pretty blunt in saying, we did this big workshop and a big tech company sent a bunch of their engineers to the workshop. I think it was actually for this refugee workshop. And I said, just being honest, why are you guys sending people to this workshop? And they said, well, to be blunt, we're in a war for talent. And millennials don't jump out of bed in the morning to make a search algorithm 1 millisecond faster. Mm-hmm. They want to, tackle refugees. They want to tackle climate change. They want to tackle, online extremism. They want to tackle these big, juicy global challenges. And so if we can send them to your workshops and then have them spend, 3-6 months of their time, 20% of their time working on building one of the solutions or ideas that came out of one of your workshops, they're happy, we're happy, they want to stay at our company longer, we get to contribute to the world. So, some companies see this as straight up employee engagement, which is, we're happy to really be their partners in that. So it's really about how do we align incentives in a way that actually drives impact. And, and I will say that that's more of an art than a science. And when you ask me about what are some of our challenges, I would say when you're trying to get a company on board to partner with you on something and it's not part of their core business, unless it's a very easy ask, it's hard to sustain the momentum going forward. And sometimes you'll get them to launch a great idea, but then there's no sustainability moving forward because it's not their job to sort of sustain these. And so we've been playing with lots of different models over the past year of how do we, harness that initial burst of energy that comes, from an ask from the Secretary of State or from like a really energizing conference or workshop. How do we then take that and maybe partner a tech company with an NGO who does have that sort of long-term sustainment mandate, or work with a foundation to keep moving that forward, or find the right partner in the U.S. government or a foreign partner to work with. And so that's probably been our biggest challenge is harnessing that initial burst of energy into long-term sustainable initiatives.
How much do you find, in a workshop like this, or when you come out with an ask like the Syria conference, how much are companies coming in and say, hey, we've got a solution that we can quickly apply it and, customize it a little bit and boom, it's working, as opposed to, hey, we see the problem, let's build something totally bespoke and, totally new thing. And sort of the foundation underneath that question would be, I could see companies saying, hey, here's a problem we could solve. This becomes, we've been waiting for a reason to solve this problem or create this tech anyway, and we then can plug it into our business offering.
I mean, I will say that tech companies and people here in the tech ecosystem, they love this phrase, they're solving what they call wicked problems, and I think that is
wicked is in like a Texas wicked, or like wicked is in like, Syria wicked.
Like juicy, complex, complicated, no obvious answers, that kind of wicked, not like Wicked Witch of the West. But that's definitely another sort of term of art out here, the wicked problems. And I think that going back to that question of, you're the State Department, you don't have any money, why will people talk to you? We don't have money, but we have great challenges. And our challenges are wicked. Mm-hmm. And
you've got access, right? I feel like for a Silicon Valley to show up in Syria and have, and be able to do that, or show up in Iraq or show up in South Sudan, that's a pretty big ask, right?
Yeah, and like we, if you want to solve a juicy challenge, we've got them for you, and not in short supply. And so, but if that's the incentive for a lot of these people coming to the table, you got to co-create the solution with them. You got to, part of the problem solving is what they really enjoy. So there, lots of other folks come out here to do Silicon Valley engagement, and it's like, here's what we need, give us this. And the companies are like, screw you. And so what really brings people to the table here is say, hey, we've got this challenge and it's really difficult to solve. Like, do you want to work with us on it? And that's what people really enjoy doing. And so I think that is, and also, so I think that is how we've learned and evolved. We didn't always have that approach, but we've learned that's what really generates the best collaborations out here. And, I come from a design thinking background and I teach at the Stanford Design School. And so I'm all about the human-centered design approach. And, to use the old cliche, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so, some tech companies, like, they have their hammer. And, any problem they have, that's the tool that they're going to use. And sometimes that's not the right tool to use. And so that's why we like to convene. That's why we don't just have these targeted. Sometimes we'll have a targeted intervention where we'll go to one specific tech company and say, hey, we want to work with you on this issue. But a lot of times we convene people from across the tech ecosystem so that we're not just taking the hammer and, and so everything looks like a nail, but we're actually looking at what is the best solution to this. And sometimes, one company's solution is not the answer, but an engineer at that company can really help, and we try to bring in not just the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples, all of which have been fantastic partners for us, but we also try and bring in, the mid-sized companies, the startups, the incubators, the accelerators. We think about Silicon Valley really broadly. We bring in the VCs, the venture capitalists, the impact investors, the foundations out here. There's a really rich NGO community out here, philanthropy sector, the universities. I mean, Stanford and Berkeley and all the universities out here are just so rich with talent, both in the instructor and the student world, and the innovation and design community out here. We're not just looking for the typical players in Silicon Valley, but we feel like the broader we go and the more diversity from this ecosystem that we tap into, the better our solutions will be.
In using the nomenclature of Silicon Valley, is there a big fat fail that you can share with us? That or...
I mean, what I would say is, I'm trying to think of which one to share. I think that without getting into too many specifics, I would say there was one workshop initially where I sort of gave you an example with the refugee workshop, but another workshop we did where we generated all these ideas, and this was very early on in our time here. And I said, who's going to take these ideas forward? And people raised their hand. And then I said, great. I'll check in with you. And then you realize that people go back to their day jobs, and we didn't really establish mechanisms for executing those ideas. And so realizing that a lot of these ideas really need hand-holding, and we need to be selective in saying, okay, maybe we came up with 8 great ideas, but maybe let's focus on 4 of them that we're really going to launch, and that we really need to partner first of all, with the subject matter experts at the State Department, so that we can ensure that the ideas that come out of our Silicon Valley engagements are not just, unmoored from reality in these pie-in-the-sky ideas that aren't grounded in, what actually works, but also that there's people whose job it is to plug in these ideas into the broader ecosystem of a challenge. And so we've launched 3 major initiatives since we've been out here. One around refugees, one around tracking nuclear weapons, and one around energy access, expanding access to clean energy in off-grid communities in developing world. And so each one we've gotten better and better at how do we do that follow through? How do we pick targeted interventions so that things actually come to fruition rather than sort of sending out a bunch of ideas into the world and having unclear impact on the other side?
We don't have time for today, but man, the tracking nuclear weapons. Whew,
oh yeah,
that's got to be an intense workshop.
We're actually having a follow-up to that one on Wednesday and 2 days from now. And there's some cool stuff that came out of that workshop in terms of the tools that we use to track nuclear weapons today, technology. A lot of it dates back to the 70s and 80s in the Cold War, when government controlled the means for like satellite imagery and sensor data and geospatial imagery. And like now you can get that stuff on the internet for free. And so how do we leverage the general public on everything from analyzing satellite data to tracking social media posts to looking at supply chains to detecting seismic activity that might indicate underground nuclear tests, using the accelerometer in your iPhone. I mean, the possibilities are really endless. And we came out with 4 ideas for pilot projects that have been running since our workshop 6 months ago, and we're convening everyone together again to sort of see where those pilot projects have gone and see how the different tech companies who came to the original workshop can re-engage on some of those projects. But man, that was some Dr. Strangelove stuff
that is intense.
in that workshop.
I'm just thinking about people walking around with their phones in their pockets and they're actually measuring seismic activity and stuff. That's just
we have a pilot project on that exact thing. But I will say, and just to be totally honest, like there are some companies that are like, we don't have time to talk to you. Like we're here to make money. Like we have to get to our C round. We have to make our quarterly earnings. Like the stuff that you're talking about, it's nice to haves. It's not core to our business. Like we don't have time to talk to you. And like that's fine, and there was, one incubator who I met with who said, I'll be honest, if one of my startups in my incubator got an email from you inviting them to a workshop on refugees, I would tell them that they absolutely cannot go to that because their job is to like build their MVP and get their, A round. Whereas I went to another incubator down the block and I said, hey, we want to invite some of your startups to our workshop. And they said, oh, that sounds amazing. We're going to do like an internal competition to decide which one of our startups gets to go to your workshops and be involved in your initiatives. So it really, it's really hit or miss in terms of how people see the value proposition of engaging on a lot of these global challenges.
Do you find yourself often having difficult conversations around data security, access to data, again, sort of following on from the Snowden effect where you have the exuberance coming to these workshops, but then they're like, but what are we going to do about how we store the data or anonymity or these kinds of things?
Well, I think that a lot of the hot button issues are actually not really in the purview of the State Department. It's more the Justice Department. So, people learn that pretty quickly. And there's a lot of people who just see us as the government, but the people who really work day in, day out on these issues know how to distinguish between the different branches of government and whose job is what. But I also think that, a lot of those issues are what get the hot button, that's what gets the headlines, but people don't hear about all the amazing things that we're collaborating on, whether it's Airbnb opening up their platform to host refugees being resettled here in the US, or Google sending 10,000 Chromebooks to refugee camps in the Middle East. Like all that stuff, like we're actually doing amazing things, running these tech boot camps in the Middle East to teach women and girls how to code and build their own apps and start tech startups. Like there's so much opportunity for us to so much goodness that we're collaborating on that it really does eclipse the headline issues. But the less sexy collaborations, they're not what most people hear about.
One of the things that the listeners to this podcast may be thinking in the back of their minds, at least I have, is it almost sounds like there may be a classic issue here of, U.S. government went to Silicon Valley and the U.S. and we're talking about, hey, how do we help solve these problems in not U.S., right? Are you talking about, or is the State Department considering piloting out the same thing that you've done in other tech hubs like Mumbai or other places in Southeast Asia or, Nairobi,
Sure,
where you can have these same conversations with people and be much closer to the problems?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, all of our engagements here, we try to balance trying to tap into the Silicon Valley ecosystem with bringing local voices and on the ground voices into the conversation. So we've done 2 workshops on energy access, and one of them, we brought 30 entrepreneurs from around the world, from outside the US and mostly from Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And for our second one, we brought 16 of them in, just because, you're right. Sometimes it can be almost silly having these conversations with a bunch of Silicon Valley people whose biggest problem is like they can't get their dry cleaning fast enough. And they're trying to solve these problems in Africa or South Asia or Latin America in completely different contexts. So we're always sure to have those perspectives represented, but we do go out, and so one thing that the State Department has done is we've created this annual conference called the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, where we bring together hundreds of entrepreneurs from, this last one we did, we brought 1,000 entrepreneurs and investors from 170 different countries together for 3 days of workshops on, how do we build tech products that address a lot of these key issues. And so we've done it over the past 7 years in different countries around the world. We've done it in Morocco, we've done it in Malaysia, we've done it in Kenya, we've done it in Turkey. And for the last one of the Obama administration, we decided to do it here in Silicon Valley. So we brought those 1,000 entrepreneurs and investors to Silicon Valley, and we had the meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, with President Obama came out, Secretary of State Kerry came out for it. We had, the CEO of Google and Airbnb and Uber and LinkedIn and all these big tech companies meeting, directly in small groups with these entrepreneurs from around the world. And so we bring them to Silicon Valley. We bring Silicon Valley to them, whether it's these tech boot camps that I mentioned that we hold in dozens of countries around the world, this Tech Women program where we're mentoring women in developing countries, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa around technology. We support incubators and accelerator programs in countries around the world. And so our embassies are driving a lot of great work on innovation internationally. And a lot of my job is to get people from Silicon Valley to come out to these countries to help people, first of all, to help people locally so they can help build indigenous innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems there. But then also so Silicon Valley people can frankly get outside of their bubble and see the challenges that the rest of the world are dealing with and see, how can we create technological solutions that can meet their needs and not just kind of Palo Alto needs.
How do we follow your work? I mean, is there a way for us to follow up on the workshops you do or see what's coming out of this particular initiative?
Well, I would say that for the past year, to borrow another Silicon Valley cliche, is that we've been in a bit of stealth mode in that we didn't want to sort of start touting our accomplishments until we had accomplishments, and not just we held a workshop because as you may know in government, sometimes holding a workshop is seen as an end unto itself and an accomplishment unto itself. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to, hold workshops and conferences and summits and convenings, but then actually have concrete impact come out of that. And now that we've had our first year, we've been approved in our official State Department office, we're starting to talk more publicly about what we've been doing out here. As, this podcast is, one of the first times I've spoken publicly about what we're doing out here.
Super honored, thanks.
Yeah, well, all you got to do is ask. And so... So probably the best way, I hate to say it right now, is probably on my Twitter feed.
Look at you're about to get 1,000 new followers. Awesome.
I was going to say it's also a nice little plug for my Twitter feed, my anemic Twitter feed. But I'm always trying to tweet, and we do have a Medium channel that highlights some of our work. If you go to if you just, I don't know the exact URL, but if you just Google innovation, it's called the Innovation Forum. So if you Google Innovation Forum Medium or search for that on medium.com, then you can read a lot of what we do. But now that we're sort of entering our second year, you asked me what's next for us is really building that public profile so that we can share some of our successes, but also some of our learnings and some of our best practices on how to engage with Silicon Valley. There's definitely a zeitgeist of aid organizations and international organizations that are looking to set up Silicon Valley outposts. And so I probably spend a good portion of my time meeting with those people and trying to guide them, even though I've only been here for a year. That's what passes for an expert because it's such a nascent space. And so, for example, the UN is opening an innovation lab here in San Francisco. And I spent a few hours about 2 or 3 weeks ago meeting with the senior leadership team from the UN that's forming an office out here. And so we want to sort of more publicly share some of our successes, some of our failures, and some of our learnings. And so hopefully we'll have more of a public profile and somewhere where you can read about our work in the coming weeks.
Lots of juicy stuff there to follow. This is fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you're going to be having more of a public profile going forward, and I'm sure that the people listening to the podcast will be very interested to follow up. The last two questions I have for you are two that I ask every guest here on the Terms of Reference podcast for this particular series on innovation. And the first one is, you may have already told us the answer, but maybe you can get more specific. Who do you pay attention to? What Twitter feeds do you follow? Do you read blogs? Do you have magazines? Or is it more just because you're in the meetings, this is how you stay up to date on what innovations are and what's possible out there?
Sure. Well, what I will say is a few quick little things. One is I don't go to conferences. I have a no conference rule.
Amen.
I don't remember the last time I went to a conference that I actually was happy that I went to the conference.
You may have just, put a dent in the $100 million conference ecosystem.
Yes, that's true. And I do speak at conferences sometimes. So, it's not, I'm part of the problem. If you do go to conferences, go to panels on topics that you know nothing about. Because I always find people go to conferences and they pick the panels on like the issues that they work on. And you're not going to learn 99 times out of 100, you're not going to learn something new if you go to a panel on a topic that you work on. But there's this like very human instinct to want to go to the things that like are relevant to you. And so I always go and pick the most obscure topics, if I do find myself at a conference, and I always end up learning something new. I do read, the typical tech sources, whether it's Wired or TechCrunch or VentureBeat or things like that, because you got to stay abreast with what's going on out here. But for me, what's been most important in Silicon Valley is staying connected to the startup ecosystem, because it can be really easy to have all of your attention pulled in by Facebook and Google and the big tech companies who really can, are best positioned to move the needle on a lot of this stuff. But it's the tech companies, it's the startups that are the heart and soul of Silicon Valley. And they'll really tell you, where the cutting edge trends are. And so I spent a lot of time going to showcases and demo days and pitch competitions. And so that I find incredibly valuable, and I've been able to build some really impactful partnerships through that. And I would say two other places that are really valuable. One is the venture capital community, because it's venture capitalists' job to know what's coming next and where all the trends are. And they have a unique perch in Silicon Valley where they look across companies rather than within a particular company. And so I always try every week to grab lunch or coffee with some venture capitalists, because they almost always have some really interesting insights. And lastly, it's the student population. I teach 2 classes at Stanford and 2 classes at Berkeley. I teach a class at Stanford called Hacking for Diplomacy in the engineering school, and I teach a class called Designing for Refugees in the design school. And at Berkeley, just taught a class in their clean energy innovation class in their entrepreneurship program. And then next semester, I'm teaching a class called Designing Technology to Combat Violent Extremism. I feel so enriched by working with students. First of all, their optimism and their passion is so inspiring. They're really on the cutting edge of a lot of these technology. The university is really driving a lot of the ecosystem here in Silicon Valley. So I'm always sure to stay plugged into the tech community here, to the student community here.
Last question I have for you. You are in such a fortunate position to just sort of be plugged into all the latest shiny objects that are coming along. Is there a particular shiny object or solution or process or thing that you just think is, a potential super game changer that you want to geek out on or you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, I think that these days what I'm looking at is I'm really interested in blockchain, and particularly the non-financial use cases of blockchain. I mean, people spend a lot of time looking at Bitcoins and Ethereum and sort of the other sort of digital currencies, but there's a lot of really interesting use cases for blockchain, and everything ranging from universal identification and tracking refugees all the way over to the energy sector. And so blockchain is something that I'm following. And then, of course, like AI, and particularly AI and the intersection with the information and disinformation space. I mean, it's clearly coming into stark relief in our own domestic politics, but it's playing very interesting both positive and negative roles internationally. And we as the State Department really need to learn how to operate as diplomats in that more complex information environment. So those are trends that I'm tracking pretty closely as well.
Zvika, this has been just a fantastic conversation. I wish you all the best, and really looking forward to following up with you maybe a little later next year to see how the publicity is going and what the next step might be.
Great. Well, it's been my pleasure chatting with you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.